So this is John Siciliano from the Penguin Classics. I'm here with Julia Lovell, the translator of The Real Story of A and Other Tales of China, which is the first modern Chinese classic to be published in the Penguin Classics. It's the complete stories of Lu Xun, and we're going to talk about Lu Xun today. When I came to the Penguin Classics 4 years ago, I'd heard a lot about Lu Xun from other people, and I knew that Lu Xun would be the obvious first modern Chinese classic in the Penguin Classics. Would you share that view that he's the obvious candidate?
Yes, I think I would. I think that, for example, he was the first modern Chinese author who I encountered in the original when I was just starting out learning Chinese as an undergraduate. The short stories that I first encountered were sort of very dark, very bleak, very bitter short stories such as Tomorrow or Medicine, which are, they're sort of already sort of in capsule form. They capture his very dark, satirical, bitter vision of the early 20th century China that he perceived around him. But he's also an utterly canonical figure in China as well, for two reasons. The first reason is sort of, again, for his direct socio-political fight, I suppose, for these very, very powerful snapshots of Republican China that he captured. But he's also acclaimed for he's acclaimed as a stylist for the richness and the variety of his language and style. He veers from sort of surrealism, satire, dark humour, lyricism, all these different styles to sort of capture what he saw around him. So I suppose to reach for a sort of roughly European comparison, you could say that he's sort of kind of Dickens and Joyce rolled into one for the modern Chinese canon.
Time magazine, when they reviewed this volume, the headline of their review was China's Orwell.
I think Orwell is a great comparison as well. I suppose what I was trying to sort of draw attention to was also the sort of very, very strong literary value of Lu Xun as well. I think a bugbear for reception of Chinese literature amongst Anglophone readerships for several decades is a tendency to view Chinese writing as a source of useful political or historical information on China, rather than viewing it as works of art or works of literature. And I'd say sort of the situation is interestingly different in how Japanese literature is received. There are authors such as Mishima or Kawabata who are sort of seen as great sort of representatives, I suppose, of Japanese narrative art, whereas Chinese writing, partly because of the stigma of communism, has been sort of seen as very, very political. I think, yes, Lu Xun absolutely does have that political impact as well, and I think he's sort of a great example of 20th century China's very, very powerful traditions of dissent and social criticism. But I suppose I was keen to draw attention to the fact that he's not just a political theorist, although he was a very, very powerful sort of polemicist as well, but he's also a great stylist.
Another comparison would, I guess, be Gogol. Gogol, of course, has a story called The Diary of a Madman, which I guess was the inspiration for Lu Xun's story. Yeah.
Exactly. And certainly the Eastern European tradition was a big influence on Lu Xun himself. Polish writers, German writers, and of course Russian writers. Lu Xun himself could not read these European languages, but he was sort of a voracious reader of translators and also a translator himself. But he read a lot of these works translated either into Chinese or more often into Japanese. And I think that's sort of another interesting part of Lu Xun's legacy, I suppose, or sort of Lu Xun's significance in 20th century Chinese writing, because sort of in Western headlines about China at the moment, quite rightly, we do hear a lot about draconian literary censorship, and that's quite right. But sometimes I think the volume of that particular story can also drown out the fact that, apart from the anomalous decades of Maoism, 20th century Chinese literature has sort of, at most times been just as, and arguably, if not more, cosmopolitan than its British or American counterparts.
So then Lu Xun is a good and perhaps the obvious candidate to be our first modern Chinese classic in the Penguin Classics, and not just because he's the best known, but he also is the writer who best effected a break with the past in terms of style. He's called the father of modern Chinese literature. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what kind of break he represents from what came before him in Chinese letters?
I suppose when Lu Xun was born, or in his childhood, his future as a kind of cultural iconoclast, as sort of culture of sort of one of traditional China's most acerbic critics, would have looked completely implausible, completely improbable, because he was born into a very, very conventional family, a family of sort of civil servants who were very high up in the imperial civil service. And he received this sort of fairly traditional, fairly stultifying Confucian tradition, which he also satirizes in his first story, Nostalgia, which is the first story of the collection. Right. Through the 1880s and 1890s, there are a series of events which very much seem to alienate him from the tradition. First of all, his grandfather, who's this very high-ranking official, is sentenced to death for having accepted bribes for the highly competitive imperial civil service competition. And this really sort of unseats the family finances, because the family has to shell out huge amounts of money for bribes in order to suspend this sentence. Lu Xun's father is a failed scholar, failed bureaucrat himself, and effectively sort of drinks the family fortune away and smokes it away in an opium addiction. And his ill health really finally unseats the family finances, because they have to spend a lot of money on these traditional Chinese remedies. And sort of Lu Xun witnesses the sort of decline of his father at first hand. And this is, I think, is sort of one of the very, very influential moments in Lu Xun's life, when he sees how these traditional Chinese doctors are sort of prescribing grasshoppers and ink to heal his father. So in the
monogamous crickets, I think
monogamous crickets.
In your introduction.
Yes, exactly. And that's only sort of one of the more mainstream remedies that are suggested. Mm-hmm. So in the 1890s, Lu Xun joins one of the earliest generations of educated Chinese young men to abandon the old Confucian stream of education and applies himself to new Western forms of learning, chemistry and medicine. And this leads him in the end to study medicine in Japan. And while in Japan, he sort of undergoes this very, very famous conversion to a literary career when he's shown at the end of one of his lectures a slide from the Russo-Japanese War, in which is, of course, being fought on Chinese territory, and in which a Chinese spy is being executed by the Japanese for having worked for the Russians. And he sort of describes very vividly the audience of this execution. It's an audience of his fellow Chinese who seem to be just sort of completely gawping at this man, totally oblivious to the sort of message of the execution, which is that sort of China has completely lost control of its own destiny, of its own sovereignty. It's being fought over by Russians and Japanese. They have complete control over Chinese lives. Those experiences that turn him into a foremost critic of China's national character, quote unquote, these experiences that sort of inevitably over the next 10 or 20 years cause him to spill out this oeuvre of short stories which are so acerbic and so critical ordinary rural Chinese life. And his locus classicus of this is one of his longest short stories called The Story of RQ, which is his most extended denunciation of what he sees as the idiotic Chinese everyman. So his anti-hero here, this man called RQ, is a kind of opportunity for Lu Xun to hang out to dry all the flaws as he sees them in the Chinese national character. So sort of sense of superiority and complacency and stupidity and laziness, told in this very excoriating, blackly humorous style.
I love the thinking behind RQ, why he chose RQ. Could you tell us that story?
One story that I heard for why he chooses this name is that the letter Q resembles a sort of a blank Chinese face with a pigtail, which of course in sort of the late imperial and early republican era was the prescribed hairstyle for all Chinese men. So it was a cliched look of a Chinese man.